Okay, so we talked week before last. If you remember, we talked about come out of the bushes, come sit at the table. And the week before that, if you remember, we talked about the church at Ephesus. And what was significant about the church at Ephesus? They had lost or left the things that they had first loved. All right? And remember, what was it that they had first loved, or what was their first love? Jesus tells the church at Ephesus, you're doing great things for me, but you've left your first love. And it was how they accepted the people. Yes, how they welcomed people. Remember, they were sort of blocking people from coming in and saying, hey, if you don't live right, you can't be a part of us. They had sort of rejected that first love, right? So, turn your Bibles today to Luke chapter 15. I'm going to read it out of the Message, but you can follow along pretty easily in the NIV. Luke 15, verse 1. So, we're going to go there, but actually we're not going to start with verse 1. Sorry. I want to start Luke 15, verse 11.
Sure.
Luke 15 and 11. And so I'm going to read it out of the Message version. All right? It says, this is Jesus speaking. Okay? He's going to teach the parable. He says, then he said, there once was a man who had 2 sons. The younger said to his father, Father, I want what's coming to me. Now, before we go any further, that's essentially saying his inheritance. So you know that when parents die, whatever they have left, they generally pass on to their children. That's called an inheritance. Okay? All right, so that's the inheritance. So he's like, look, I want my inheritance now. I want my share now. I don't want to wait until you're dead. So it's interesting that he would say this. But the father doesn't argue. He says, so the father divided the property between them, the 2 sons. It wasn't long before the younger son packed his bags and left for a distant country. There, undisciplined and dissipated, he wasted everything he had. Now what he means, he just spent, the money was burning a hole in his pocket, and he just spent it all having a good time. And he went through all of his money. There was a bad famine all through the country, and he began to hurt. He signed on with a citizen there who assigned him to his fields to slop the pigs. He was so hungry that he would have eaten the corn cobs in the pig slop, but no one would give him any. So essentially he was feeding the pigs, and he wasn't even allowed to eat what the pigs were eating. So he's essentially starving. That brought him to his senses. He said, all those farm hands working for my father sit down at 3 meals a day, and here I am starving to death. I'm going back to my father. I'll say to him, Father, I've sinned against God, and I've sinned before you. I don't deserve to be called your son. Take me on as a hired hand. He got up right away and went home to his father. When he was still a long way off, the father saw him, his heart pounding. He ran out, embraced him, and kissed him. The son started his speech. Father, I've sinned against God. I've sinned before you. I don't deserve to be called your son ever again. But the father wasn't listening. He was calling to his servants, quick, bring a clean set of clothes and dress him. Put the family ring on his fingers and sandals on his feet. Then get a grain-fed calf and roast it. We're going to feast. We're going to have a wonderful time. My son is here, given up for dead and now alive, given up for lost and now found. And they began to have a wonderful time. All this time, the older son was out in the field. When the day's work was done, he came in. As he approached the house, he heard music and dancing. Calling over to one of the houseboys, he asked what was going on. He told him, your brother came home. Your father has ordered a feast, barbecued beef, because he has him home safe and sound. The older brother stalked off in an angry sulk and refused to join in. His father came out and tried to talk to him, but he wouldn't listen. The son said, look how many years I've stayed here serving you, never giving you one moment of grief. But have you ever thrown a party for me or my friends? Then this son of yours who's thrown away your money on all sorts of things shows up, and you go all out with a feast. His father said, son, you don't understand. You're with me all the time, and everything that is mine is yours. But this is a wonderful time, and we had to celebrate. This brother of yours was dead, and he's alive. Was lost, and he's found. So, this is the story of the prodigal son. The story of the prodigal son. This is what it's called because it's all about the son. However, I'm not sure that that's really the case. So before I begin, I'll say that if I have a title for today's lesson or sermon or talk or whatever you would like to call it, it would be the story or a message to the church of the older brother. A lesson for the church or a message to the church of the older brother. All right, so when we talk about this story, what's it about? Just in a quick synopsis, what is this story about?
Forgiveness and forgiveness of sins and the unconditional love.
Right, that's great. So this is how we've always looked at this story. This kid, he goes and spends off his father's inheritance, and then he runs out of everything, and he comes home, and what does the father do? He welcomes him, and we've always, throughout the church history, we've looked at these verses and says, my son was lost, and now he's found. He was dead, and now he's alive. And we always look at that and say, oh, wonderful, God forgives me. God's ready to welcome me back. But this story really isn't about that. And so to understand what this story really is about, we need to look a little bit further back to verses 1 and 2 of chapter 15. So listen to this. And then you start to kind of understand what the story really is about. Verse 1, by this time, a lot of men and women of doubtful reputation were hanging around Jesus. In other words, these are people who maybe weren't very nice, or they went out and partied, or they were doing tax collectors, robbers, criminals, people who had really bad backgrounds. And so you've got all these kind of people who are hanging out with Jesus. It says they were listening intently. The Pharisees and religion scholars were not pleased at all. They growled, he takes in sinners, and he eats meals with them, treating them like old friends. Their grumbling triggered a story. Suppose one of you had 100 sheep and lost one. Wouldn't you leave the 99 in the wilderness and go after the lost one until you found it? When found, you can be sure that you would put it across your shoulders, rejoicing. When you got home, you call your friends and neighbors saying, celebrate with me, I found my lost sheep. Count on it. There's more joy in heaven over one sinner's rescued than over 99 good people in no need of rescue. Or imagine a woman who has 10 coins and loses one. Won't she light a lamp and scour the house looking in every nook and cranny until she finds it? And when she finds it, you can be sure she'll call her friends and neighbors, celebrate with me, I found my lost coin. Count on it. There's a kind of party God's angels throw every time a lost soul comes home. And then he tells the story of the prodigal son. So then let's ask, who is this story really about and who is it intended for? Well, when you think about it, this story is not about redemption. Although that happens in the story. The story is not about forgiveness and grace, although it happens in the story. This story is about the older brother, and it's about the religion scholars and the Pharisees. Because remember what it says right here at the beginning. By this time, a lot of men and women of doubtful or bad reputation were hanging around Jesus, listening intently. The Pharisees and religious scholars were not pleased. They growled, he takes in sinners and eats meals with them, treating them like old friends. So they're very upset that all these people that Jesus is bringing around him, and he's talking with them, and he's hanging out with them, and they're like, wait a minute now. We don't like this, Jesus. We're not really happy about you spending all this time. Because why? Who are supposed to be the church people of that day? Who are the church people during this time? Who? The Pharisees, yes, the Pharisees. So let me give you a little background about what the Pharisees actually were. So throughout, like anywhere from about 300 to 100, or maybe it's about 200 to 100, somewhere in that range, BC, before Christ, you have a huge Greek influence in what is Judea, which is formerly called Israel, but now it's called Judea. Okay? And so they're trying to get these Jews to start thinking and acting like Greeks. which means, we don't follow the law so much anymore. We don't worry about the purity stuff anymore. And maybe we'll kind of acknowledge Zeus and Andromeda and Perseus and all the kind of gods of mythologies. And so some of the Jews started to kind of become more Greek-like. And there's a faction of Jews that said, no, we must hold the line. We must remain faithful to God and to our law. And they were called, or became called, Pharisees. So what started out as an effort to keep the Jewish nation pure and not go off to the paths of the Greeks becomes a group that now holds everyone to a standard that's too high to be held. So now if you're not quite right, if you don't quite live like you're supposed to live, the Pharisees say, we don't want any part of you. You can't be a part of us. You're bad. You're a sinner. So they've kind of turned this whole thing into, you have to pass this test in order to be a good Jew. Make sure you do this, do that, do this, do that, give this, give that, don't eat this, don't touch that. And so now when Jesus comes and he's sitting there and he's got all these people around him who would fail every test the Pharisees would give, they're upset. They're not happy. You're not supposed to let these people in. They're not good Jews. And so what does Jesus do? He talks about a missing lamb. He talks about a lost coin. And then he tells a story of two brothers. And all of that stuff, especially the story of the two brothers, is intended not for those of us who are listening to say, oh, thank you, Lord, you're going to take us back. No. It was intended for the Pharisees as a lesson to them. It's not a story about people who stray. This is a parable about Jews and Gentiles, sinners and saints, outsiders and insiders. Now, this is very important that you get this, because we have this kind of idea that as God's children, as Christians, as people who follow Christ, we see ourselves as being on the inside. We're on the inside with God. Okay? We're the right people, and people who don't believe, well, they're the wrong people. We're on the inside, they're on the outside. We're the saints, they're the sinners. And so this is kind of the mentality the Pharisees have. And sometimes it's kind of the mentality that we have. And that we think that because we're on the inside, that Jesus wants to spend time with us. But think about the first parable, the parable of the lamb. Where are the insiders at? They're all in one group, right? All those lambs, how many were there? 99, yes. And what does Jesus do? Who's using the example of the shepherd, which is supposed to represent Christ. He leaves the 99 and he goes to find the straggler. Or the coins are all left on a counter and the lady scours the floor to try to find the missing coin. And now, as the brother is gone, he's trying to come home. The father leaves the household, the older brother, and he goes and hugs and kisses the younger brother. This is a story that's very important. So let me explain to you why this is very important. All right? So turn now to Revelation. Chapter 2. Revelation chapter 2 and verse 1. He says, write this to Ephesus, the angel of the church, the one with 7 stars in his right fist grip, striding through the golden 7 light circles. Speak. Remember, that's all imagery. Remember, Revelation is all about symbols and imagery. And he's talking about the one who comes through. He's got a grip on the churches and he's walking through the middle of the churches. That's what the 7 represents here. Okay? I see what you've done, your hard work, your hard work, your refusal to quit. I know you can't stomach evil and that you weed out apostolic pretenders. I know your persistence, your courage in my cause that you never wear out. Or, more to the point, let's take it back to the story. I know that you have been holding the line against the Greeks, that you have stood for being a Jew, that you have walked hard in the face of Roman oppression, that you are keeping the line and you're keeping Jews in their place and we're keeping our Jewish religion pure. Do you see how the two are similar? The history of the Pharisees on one side doing everything they can to stay pure and holy before God. And on the other side, the church at Ephesus. Here we go again. But you walked away from your first love. Why? What's going on with you anyway? Do you have any idea how far you've fallen? Turn back, recover your dear early love. No time to waste, for I'm on my way to remove your light from the golden circle. So remember, we read from the New Revised Standard Version last week, and it said, you have left from the things that you first loved, the way of doing your first love. And so what he's talking about here is you've become like the Pharisees. And remember, we talked about this 3 weeks ago. And so here we are, Jesus is telling this parable to the religious scholars, and now we have Jesus again speaking almost an identical message to the church at Ephesus 60 years later. And so one of the reasons I wanted to put this together is because what comes next in the story of the prodigal son. So now turn back to Luke, okay? I know we're jumping a bit, but that's okay. Back to Luke chapter 15. Listen to what happens here. We're going to read from verse 22. Says, but the father wasn't listening. He called to the servants, quick, bring a clean set of clothes and dress him. Put the family ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Then get a grain-fed calf and roast it. We're going to feast. We're going to have a wonderful time. My son is here, given up for dead and now alive. And they began to have a wonderful time. Now, here's where this story gets important. Remember back. Let's tie it all together. What was it that triggers this story? What is it that triggers the story? He was eating with them. He was eating with them. Listen to this. By this time, a lot of men and women of doubtful reputation were hanging around Jesus, listening intently. The Pharisees and religious scholars were not pleased. They growled, he takes in sinners and eats meals with them. He takes in sinners and he eats meals with them. And then we get into the story of the prodigal son. But let me just stop there and just ask this question. Who is it that Jesus is not eating with? He is not eating with the Pharisees. And this is very important that you catch this. It doesn't say that here. What does it say? He's eating with them, which means he's not eating with Pharisees. He's eating with the bad people, the sinners, the people who are tax collectors and people who are whatever. They're bad people. So the Pharisees called them. And so Jesus is eating with them. He's not eating with the Pharisees, because you have to remember that in this culture, sharing a meal with someone is not just dinner. It's what you do to honor people. It's a way of honoring someone. So if we look back in that time, and let's say I wanted to honor Abby, I would host a meal for her, and I'd bring her in and say, hey, we're having a great big meal, and we would all sit around and we'd go out and get the best looking calf or the best looking sheep, and we'd cook it, and we'd have great food, and we'd sit there and we'd have great wine, and we'd talk, and we'd have a nice time, and I would invite my friends from around, sort of like what we would call a birthday party, but it wasn't sort of like that. It was, hey, I have an honored guest, won't you come and join me and help me honoring that? And so this is what Jesus is doing with the people who have a bad reputation. He is giving them honor in that society and that culture by sharing meals with them. And this makes the Pharisees very, very unhappy. Very unhappy.
Very uncomfortable.
Yes. Very much so. Because what else is it? Think of it this way. It's not just the fact that he is treating these people better than they should be treated. But it's also him saying, I'm not eating with you. He is rejecting them. And so this is one of the reasons why they are so upset. Now let's get to the story of the prodigal son. What does he do when the son comes home? He throws a party. He gets him dressed. He puts a ring back on his finger. He welcomes him into the family. And he makes a great big dinner and invites guests, and they have a great big party. But remember who the story is for. Because the story doesn't end there. My son was lost and is now found. No, 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 no. The story continues because now we have the older brother who is anxious and he's upset. And he won't go into the dinner and he won't participate because he says that brother is no good. And you're having a dinner for him. You're having a dinner for him. How could you do this? We can't have people like that in our home. Which is what the church at Ephesus was doing. They were doing the exact same thing. So you see how the two stories start to come together between the church at Ephesus and the story of the prodigal son. And so you can now call this, the church at Ephesus, the church of the older brother. Now do you see? The church of the older brother. Because this is a church that thinks we're on the inside, we're not on the outside. And if you want to come in here, you have to do right, you have to be right, and you have to live right. And there's no compromise, and there's no middle ground. And they're not loving anyone anymore. And this is why it compares to the prodigal son. This Christian church isn't following in the footsteps of Christ. It's not loving. It's like the Pharisees. And here's the thing we have to remember. When we talk about the church at Ephesus and when we talk about the prodigal son, all of them have one central focus: a meal. Ephesus is preventing anyone from coming in. And the Pharisees are upset because Jesus is eating with people who shouldn't be allowed in. But when we talk about the table of the Lord, the bread and the wine, when we talk about those things, that table is open. We are never to say, you can't come. You're not invited. You're not welcome here. There are no limitations and restrictions. You can't say somebody's not welcome here unless you do this, 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 and this. Because Jesus is sitting at the table with the worst of the worst people, setting, for example, for us, what? Anyone can come. Anyone should come. All should come. Think of it along this line. Think of somebody who is a bully at school, or somebody who has been somebody who can't stop lying, or somebody who is constantly making fun and laughing at other people.
Okay.
People we would look at and say, oh, God doesn't like these people. God's not happy with these people, and one day God's going to get those people. Now remember, within everybody's life, there's always a story that you don't know. There's always something going on that you don't know what's going on in their lives. And so many times when people are doing something, there's something else going there that you don't know. But who knows? God knows. God understands what's going on. And he looks at the deep heart of people. And these are the people that he goes to and says, I'd like to spend time with you. I'd like to share a meal with you. I'd like to show you grace and mercy. And in so doing, what is God doing? He's transforming their lives. How can we tell anyone they can't come? Well, certainly they can come, but they have to sit out there in the hallway, and they're certainly not allowed to have the communion. Well, you've left your first love. You've left the things that you first loved, as the NRSV says. You've left those things. And this is the warning, and this is why the bread and the wine are so important. They're so vital, because at the table of the Lord, everyone comes and everyone is treated with love and compassion and grace and mercy. And so this is why these two stories are so very important for us today to remember. We love and we welcome because Christ loved and welcomed us. And when we refuse to love and welcome others, then we're telling Jesus, well, we really appreciate you doing that for us, but we're not going to do the same for others. And you see that the church of Ephesus, that Jesus was not happy about this. So as we come today to the table of the Lord, sort of like it's not really a table per se, it's a meal or a sharing together. This is what you need to remember. God's love is not just for you. God's love is not just for me. God's love is for everyone. And when we pray and we welcome and we seek for God's kingdom among us, and when we ask God to help us, we need to be praying and seeking and asking God to help other people as well, especially those who don't love us and who don't treat us well. That's when Jesus said, you've heard it said, love your friends and hate your enemies. But I tell you, what? Love your enemies.
And pray for those who persecute you.
Pray for those who persecute you. Don't be like the church at Ephesus. Don't be like the older brother. In other words, don't be part of the church of the older brother. Because this is not what Jesus had in mind. So, we have the bread.